Michael Massa. Kemetism, also Kemeticism, sometimes referred to as Neterism, deity, or Kemetic paganism, is a neo-pagan religion and revival of the ancient Egyptian religion and related expressions of religion in classical and late antiquity. A Kemetic or Kemetic pagan is one who follows Kemetism. There are several main groups, each of which takes a different approach to its beliefs, ranging from Eclectic to Reconstructionist. However, all of these can be identified as belonging to three strains, including reconstructed Kemetism, adopting a philological and scholarly approach, a syncretic approach, and a more novel synthesis tending toward monotheism, Kemetic Orthodoxy. A Kemetic shrine, with statues of Batet, Sekhmet, Anubis, Nephthys, Thoth, and Serket. The movement's name is based on an endonym of Egypt Kemet, the conventional vocalization of hieroglyphic notation T. The word is also sometimes written as Takmet, from the fuller T. In translation from Egyptian it means, black, or in longer form, black land, which is derived from the black color of the fertile mud brought by the Nile during the annual floods, currently no longer occurring due to the existence of the Aswan Dam. Kemetics refer to the ancient Egyptian deities as the Netjeru, also referred to as the Neteru or the Netjer. Commonly Kemetics like to refer to the Netjeru with their ancient Egyptian name, in example they would refer to Horus as Heru, Thoth as Jehudi, and Anubis as Anpu. Kemetics do not consider themselves direct descendants of the ancient Egyptian religion but consistently speak of its recreation or restoration. Some Kemetics or Hermeticists claim direct continuity with secret societies allegedly continuously existing since the prohibition of paganism by Roman Emperor Theodosius I in 392 CE, or since the closing of the last functional Egyptian temple, of the goddess Isis on the island of Philae, by Emperor Justinian around 535. Though these claims are so far historically unprovable and mythical in nature. Kemetism is depicted as a modern reflection of ancient Egyptian religion, which was a supporting element of the entire ancient Egyptian culture. Reflection on ancient Egypt, however, has a very long tradition. Its roots can be traced back to the Hellenistic period, since when it has continuously developed in many streams, see Hermeticism, until the present day. It did not escape early medieval Christianity, whether it takes the form of radical rejection, extrabiblical legends of the stay of Jesus in Egypt, the recognition of the authority of Hermes Trismegistos by the Church Fathers and medieval philosophers, or the adaptation of myths associated with the goddess Isis. The common feature of these reflections is the more or less accentuated belief, referred to by Eric Hornung as Egyptosophy, that mysterious Egypt is the cradle of a special esotericism by which the highest transcendence of cognition beyond the conventional framework of conceptual logical thinking can be achieved, because Egypt was a land where gods lived among men, i.e., a land in which people were in direct contact with hidden natural forces which we, people of the modern age, have made the subjects of fairy tales. However, this approach is not only found in authors sympathetic to esotericism, 16, but also in the historical sphere, where it can take the form of interpretation update. It seems, in fact, that the holism of the ancient Egyptians is closely related to the latest natural science, to the world of quarks and bosons. In doing so, we encounter similar structures that suggest fruitful comparisons between, for example, quantum mechanics and Egyptian belief in gods. Kemetism therefore stands as the youngest alongside other unique reflections upon the same object, from which it differs in emphasis on the religious aspect of ancient Egyptian tradition. The others are usually devoted to other parts of it, such as Egyptian wisdom or magic, and interprets the culture and religion itself and its god symbolically, unlike Kemetism, and consequently, they reflect rather an imaginary Egypt, i.e., an idea of Egypt, independent of time, which is only loosely related to the historical reality. Contrast, the goal of Kemetist groups is a more or less rigorous restoration of the religious system in its historical form, although Kemetists generally admit that a completely accurate imitation of ancient practices is not always possible or even advisable. The degree of knowledge and understanding of the original ancient Egyptian thought plays an important role here, while their difficulty is due to the very nature of the subject. Ancient Egyptian religion underwent complex transformations during the pharaonic period, within which there was always a multitude of approaches and has always had its local dimension, in which one and the same god could have different forms of cult in individual nomes or even individual temples and be involved in different mythological contexts. In this respect, it can be seen quite dissimilar to the common tradition of Judaism and Christianity, and it is questionable to what extent the difference of traditions can be bridged with regard to the fact that Kemeticism develops in the area of Euro-American civilization. Due to its long development, moreover, it is difficult to seek a purely original form of Egyptian religion that can be easily pointed to and reconstructed, see Reconstructionism, but only of its forms in certain historical periods. The mentioned interpretive tradition, beginning in the Hellenistic period, did not merely adopt Egyptian religious ideas, but also fundamentally transformed them. At the same time, these new concepts often differ greatly from their original drafts. In view, it has been questioned whether their second life, and the changes brought about by it should also belong to what the Kemetists are recovering, or whether they should instead be excluded as traditions of antiquity and not of Egypt. The attitude towards this question is one of the fundamental differences between the various groups. An illustration of this problem is the question of whether the gods should be strictly worshipped by their Egyptian names or whether they can also be addressed by their Greek versions. Its significance within Kemeticism stems from the ancient Egyptian idea of the importance of name to existence. Jeremy Nadler generally distinguishes two modes of religious reflection on the ancient Egyptian tradition. It can be conceived as a restitching consisting in attempts to return to Egypt, in pursuit of a renewed state of consciousness of the people of those times, or as an effort to enter into conversation with the Egyptian experience of spiritual life, by which he states, one can get closer to the spiritual roots of the modern world. These two points of view are hard to distinguish from each other. The conceptual content of the principle of Ma'at implies the vital necessity of ritual worship of gods, possibly a universal divine force. The most common objects of veneration from the individual old Egyptian gods today are mainly Ra, Ammonius, Isis and Osiris, Thoth, Sekhmet, Batet, Hathor, but of course one can also encounter others. In defining their nature, contemporary Kemetists are fairly consistent in adhering to the ancient tradition contained in the known mythology. Modern mythological and theological works are as yet rare. In particular, there is hardly any theoretical and speculative theology in Kemetism, which is understandable on the one hand given the, more superficially seen, character of ancient Egyptian religious thought. On the other hand, thus Kemetism hardly formulates answers to problematic aspects of modern society. The practice of religious ritual and other manifestations of religious life varies from individual associations. Its centerpiece, as in the original Old Egyptian religion, is usually a cult image, most often in the form of a statue or other representation depicting the likeness of the worshipped god. Its role in the cult may be conceptualized differently not only by different currents, but also by different individuals, with no precise boundaries between the different attitudes. In a schematic distinction, the most widespread modernist Kemetism today generally attaches a more symbolic meaning to the cult image, understanding it as a means of enabling Kemetists to better focus on God, or divine power, as the proper object of veneration. Consequently, there is no need to strictly observe a particular ritual procedure. The minority traditionalist current understands the cult image as a real representation of the divine being in the human world. Therefore, in accordance with ancient Egyptian tradition, it may recommend its preservation in a special sacred container, now, from which it is to be removed only in the course of a religious ritual, described as precisely as possible and strictly observed, of which the presentation of sacrifices is the most essential part. In the absence of a binding doctrine, however, individual Kemetists may choose any combination of these aspects. Although even in this case the religious reverence shown does not belong directly to the cult image as a physical thing, but to the worshipped God who is present in it in a special way, monotheistic religions raise the objection of idolatry in this context. Kemetism, however, regards it as inappropriate, since there is nothing within its framework that realistically corresponds to this notion. The Egyptians, in fact, did not experience any marked separation of the psychic from the physical realm. And therefore, the world of material objects could also be imbued with divine power. These could serve as effective mediums through which spiritual forces manifested themselves on the material plane. In ancient Egypt there was no such thing as idols, because the ancient Egyptian mentality could perceive no such thing. It was not until the Israelites created the idea of idols. In Egypt, as Stephen Quirk notes, any object could become more than a mere physical object by performing a special ceremony. It could live permanently and thus open the way between this world and the world of the gods. The mummified body in a coffin, the cult image of a god, the statue of a king or a deceased nobleman, were all soulless objects that opening the mouth transformed into living forces, or, more precisely, into receptacles for the invisible and elusive force we call life. Followers of Kemetism generally worship a few gods, Mot, Batet, Anubis, Sekhmet, or Thoth, among others, but recognize the existence of every god. This worship generally takes the form of prayer, offerings, and setting up altars. Altars are most often constructed using a statue or two-dimensional representation of one or more given deities, as they serve as the focal point of worship. Additional items include candles, votive offerings, prayer beads, incense burners, and one or more dishes for food offerings. Most Kemetic offerings try to keep to tradition, offering the same or similar items the ancient Egyptians would have offered. It is common during worship for Kemetics to pray in the dua gesture, which models the hieroglyph meaning worship and adoration. The idea of God/gods. The looseness of the Kemetist doctrine is best captured just by defining the object of Kemetist religious veneration. Although the Egyptian religion was a polytheistic religion, though there are scholarly Egyptologists now no longer accepted distinctly minority views, contradictory, that monotheism was always covertly present in the background of the plurality of worshipped gods, and Kemetists do not deny this formal polytheism. It can be interpreted differently by different currents. Today, the minority definition of this problem is the traditionalist notion of individual gods as wholly individual beings with a separate cult that enter into the interactive relationships and agencies described in myths and legends. In accordance with the ancient Egyptian concept, any of the gods can be considered as the supreme or most powerful of the gods, analogically according to the mythological context that is currently referred to within the cult. The notion of a universal single god, if used at all, has a rather abstract meaning and is close in meaning to the philosophical notion of gender. It is a designation of a particular divine quality forming the defining feature of a group of beings of the same kind, gods rather than individually existing beings. In contemporary times, one can encounter within Kemeticism the prevalent, but somewhat more distant from the original ancient Egyptian conception, idea of a single universal divine force manifesting itself in various forms, which are the gods themselves, so that they are understood as somewhat separate but nevertheless mere aspects of it. In this case, the Kemetists follow the late antique henotheism as manifested, for example, in the cults of Serapis and Isis, originally the ancient Egyptian Isis, or in the philosophical outlook in Neoplatonism, but like other neo-pagan movements, undeniably also to the Western experience of Christian monotheism and its reflection in modern thought starting with the Enlightenment. Another variant of modernist Kemetism is monolatry, but based on the same sources. In these conceptions, leaving aside the external features derived from ancient Egyptian culture and the use of Egyptian mythological context, Kemetism in many respects bears a strong resemblance to, for example, the religion of Wicca. Perhaps this is related to the fact that it is developed in areas with a predominantly Anglo-Saxon tradition. Given this possible dualistic understanding of the object of religious veneration in Kemeticism, it is ultimately up to the individual to decide whether to focus more on an abstractly conceived divine power in the practice of their religion, or whether to prefer the more original worship of individual gods. Virtually the only Czech Kemet website Temple of the Land of Kemet notes, "This does not mean that we deny that there is one universal deity, but we argue that it probably does not exist in the way monotheists imagine it, and that this does not necessarily imply a denial of a plurality of gods." Individual gods and goddesses in their multiplicity share this divinity in the same way that we humans share one universal, humanity. The gods represent certain types of energies and qualities. The universal one God of the monotheists can hardly be present in a similar way. The same source elsewhere questions whether it is even possible to make this universal divine power itself an object of religious veneration, thus categorically rejecting any form of not only monotheism but also the aforementioned henotheism or monolatry. Kemeticism would thus place itself in the traditionalist stream of this movement. In both basic Kemetist conceptions of God/gods, the sun usually plays a non-negligible role, regardless of whether it is worshipped as a god by particular Kemetists or not, as in ancient Egyptus considered to be an analogous image of the divine power as the universal source of every single existence and of all existence in general.